Well, good afternoon. I am Monica McFarlane. I am a PhD student in the Lead Comm program. I am working with Dr. Wheeler today to give this workshop on creating space and leadership practices to make progress within complex and adaptive systems. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I'll go here. Make sure everybody can see this. All right. And everybody see my lovely Zoom slides? Perfect. All right. So a little bit about ourselves. Like I said, I'm a doctoral student.
Monica, I think it might not have come through. Is other people just seeing the black screen?
Black screen only.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me.
You might have to make it in presenter mode before you share it.
Oh, okay.
Try that. Yeah.
Let me come out of this first and then do that. Okay. Go back one. All right. Zoom meeting. There's no Zoom. All right. Let's see if this will work now. Okay. Is it in the mini or is it in the presentation mode?
It's still in the mini. It's not in presentation mode. I think part of it too. Is there a way for you to quickly just download it onto your desktop and then open it to the platform? Because I think it's when you're trying to share the screen on the web-based platform.
Okay.
Just share for you. How about that?
Yeah. Could you do that?
Okay. Yep.
I appreciate it. There we go. I can see it now. Okay. So sorry about the hiccup there. So as I stated, I'm a doctoral student in the Leadership Comm program right now. I worked at K-State for about 4.5 years. I was also got my master's there in public administration. I'm involved in a lot of community projects while I lived in Manhattan. One of them that was most important to me was being the University Support Staff Senate President. Involved in a lot of programs there at K-State. My main interests are in community engagement, leading change, and my work is centered on civil asset forfeiture reform.
Yep. And hello, everyone. You've heard my voice as well, but I'm Dr. Brandon Cleaver, Associate Professor of Civic Leadership at the Staley School. I do a lot of work around community and organization development, leading change, and work-based leadership learning and development. Some of my experience in that work is highlighted in the work that Monica and I will be presenting on today. So thanks for being here. I'll hand it back to you, Monica.
Thank you. All right, so our goal today is to basically explain the distinct differences that exist between complicated and complex systems and their leadership approaches, as well as the differences between development that's focused on leaders and leadership. Hopefully, by kind of going through these concepts, each of you will be able to come up with some ideas on how to create space that allows you to make progress in these complex and adaptive systems within the practice of your own work. If you will go to the next slide for me. So complicated versus complex leadership approaches. I feel we're going to go between the two of these and explain these differences. If you'll go to the next slide for me. So, thank you. This complicated leadership approach may be probably most familiar within the context of Western society. It focuses on entities, on individuals, and it exists within the domain of experts. It's really about trying to focus on those great man theories and how they gather people together to achieve a certain goal. We can go to the next slide. So here's kind of a little breakdown of that tripod ontology of leadership. Basically, it states that there is a particular leader And they have followers. They share a particular purpose, which then allows leadership to emerge as they are trying to attain this shared purpose. A lot of the research on that talks about the different behaviors and virtues and traits that these leaders may have that then get people to follow behind them, what things they may need to know about their followers in order to achieve the proper direction. Next. So a perfect analogy of this would probably be talking about like a ship captain. They have the vision that they need to get from point A to point B, but they also have the expert knowledge not only of the ship itself and all the parts in there and how best to make that work through different waters, but then the abilities of their crew. And so they have the ability with their expert knowledge to figure out what each individual person underneath them, that are their followers, what they can harness from them to best make that ship operate and to get there. You see a lot of this maybe in military context as well. Leaders pull out the best of their subordinates and can train them, get them developed to get to a clear purpose that they have. They have command of that situation, and it's a very closed system. It sounds pretty straightforward. However, as most of you will know, our work deals with wicked problems, and those issues are not bound within closed systems. They are usually spread across networks and multiple organizations and affect various groups. So then the question is, what happens when complexity is introduced into the system? Well, that ship captain, their ability, those heroic ideals start to kind of fall apart, because can one person particularly know what needs to happen for all of these different groups with all of these different organizations? Who's going to be able to pull all that together? That needs to be more of a collective answer. Complexity also might prevent knowing exactly the way in which to go about doing something, because it's not set. It's and we'll go into this in a minute, looking at the two differences, but basically, if you have a complicated system, it's got the ability to have at least one correct answer. There's going to be something that can be defined that you can go towards. In a complex system, you don't have that ability. It's something's always in flux. Assumptions about people's knowledge and the work and the expertise are no longer stable, because like I was saying, all those pieces are now in flux. Authority is then diffused because of the fact that it's not just within this closed system. Who owns, the responsibility of certain part, who has the authority to get a hold of one resource when you're working with, a different bureaucracy organization than you are dealing with in another city or another state, another country. If you will go to the next slide for me. So we're going to talk about the difference between complex systems and complicated systems, and why complexity leadership approaches are different. One, they focus on networks and processes. They don't focus on individual leaders. It's not a domain of experts so much. It's not that experts are not in the system, they are, but the answers emerge from the interactions between individuals, not from a particular individual having an answer. If we'll go to the next slide for me. So there are different components that help you identify when you are dealing with a complex adaptive system. And again, this is, we're talking about not a closed system, but it's a network. They are really interactive with one another. It's important to understand that interdependence is key to this type of system. We all either sink or swim together. They co-emerge based upon the cohesive groups that are in there. So if you see these pictures, you have a whole bunch of purple dots, a whole bunch of green dots, red. Each of these sections of dots are considered a cohesive group. They have a lot of redundancy within each other. They can share information between each other very quickly, and they tend to be more trusting of one another. You have these bridge points that come out from these systems, from like these red dots to these green dots, and those are called brokerage points. And these are individuals who are able to basically talk to both groups, both of these cohesive groups. In a complex adaptive system, The broker is not always the same leader. It depends on the situation that you're in. Each individual person could be a leader or a follower dependent upon the situation at hand. They're nonlinear. Again, they're unpredictable, and they self-organize between their cohesive units. If you will go to the next one for me. So to kind of really point out the differences between these, you'll have to do a click for me because I'll have some action buttons. Complicated systems are not complex. So here's a picture of an engine. This is, I believe, from a Ferrari that was discussed in one of the articles. And basically what it's saying is you can have an expert that can take apart this engine and put it right back together and it'll still continue to work. It's within a closed system, it's going to have an answer, it can be rebuilt. Otherwise, you would have a complex system, which could be like an ecosystem or rainforest, and that's not going to be the same at any point in time as it was the moment before. You're going to have different animals that are in there, you're going to have different temperatures, you're going to have different organisms. Everything is going to change. So the only way that you are going to be able to actually know something is in going back and looking at a snapshot of time. You're not going to know the answer going forward. So that's why it says there's no single right answer in those complex systems. So if you don't have an ability to know an answer, then how do you make progress? So the difference between really between the complex and the complicated systems, I would say, is that leaders within the complicated systems are always trying to manage tension. They are trying to reduce tension. Tension is considered a bad thing. They want to make everything really effective and they want to make it cohesive and let's not have the tension in. Complex systems actually thrive with tension. It's the kind of the saying is, maybe most of you may have heard this, is there's don't let a good crisis go to waste. It's like, well, how can you actually have a crisis be good? It can be good because it pushes us outside our comfort zone. Learning and growth only take place outside your comfort zones. So in order to have the ability to get out of the comfort zone, you have to have tension. Tension then creates these adaptive spaces between both entrepreneurial systems and operational systems. Operational systems are like your budgets, your schedules, those kind of hard things. The entrepreneurial systems is where you have innovative ideas and everything. So you're trying to find this good balance. The problem is in a lot of Western societies and organizations, we tend to stifle innovation because we're trying so hard to be, effective and efficient. So we're going and paying more attention to the operational systems, and we don't allow that space for adaptive solutions to come about because of the fact we're afraid of failure. That's why crises that allow you to then come up with different solutions can be considered good, because it takes you out of that comfort zone. So the question then is for the group, and that we have here on the next slide. Oh, one more. Is we want you in small groups to basically look at challenges within your own work and then think of them and identify between what is complicated and complex leadership challenges within it. And when keeping that in mind, what opportunities exist for you to create adaptive spaces in the practice of your own work?
Wonderful. Thank you, Monica. And Carrie, do you mind creating those groups? And as the groups are being created, we'd be happy to surface any questions about the content that Monica shared before folks consider this content in the context of their own work in the small groups.
How long would you like folks to be in the groups?
We were thinking 12 minutes.
Okay. Perfect. So we've got groups of 3 to 4, so that should be plenty of time to do some chatting together. You have 11 minutes plus a 1-minute comeback. So
Thanks for joining us. we'll give it a few more seconds until everyone's here. Carrie, do you mind letting me know once everyone's back?
Yep, we've got just a few more folks. They still have 38 seconds, so they might
Okay.
be taking it all.
All right, well, for those that have just joined us, welcome. We're going to get started. I will do some coaching around your challenges. So begin thinking about what you might be willing to share, and I'd be happy to talk through what this might look like through the lens of your specific work. And we'll invite folks to share out what was discussed. So we'll give it about 20 more seconds. Okay, we're good. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for being here. So you just had an opportunity in your small groups to consider how this distinction between complicated and complex adaptive systems might show up in your own work. What Monica and I were hoping that we would do is, one, give you and each group an opportunity to maybe share out and surface some questions, maybe opportunities, or even perspectives that you gain through your small group discussion. And two, if there's maybe a few brave souls that wanted to use their specific work as a case, I would be happy to offer some coaching and group thinking through as a group what that might look like in what leadership in complex adaptive systems might look like in your work. So with that said, who would be willing to get us started? Someone willing to share out what was discussed in their small group?
I mean, this is a leadership workshop after all, so I know you all have lots to talk about.
Or even if someone's wanting to elevate the work that you're advancing individually, I'd be happy to coach you and think through that.
I currently work for a nonprofit, and it's a very, it's been around for 10 years, but it's a very linear organization, but it's has so many different hands, from curriculum to elementary, middle school and high school, building gardens in the community, plus writing grants and fundraising. So it's so many different levels, but the business model is very linear.
So what's the biggest leadership challenge you're confronting right now in your work?
Very few people that do everything. So I feel like there's not enough delegation. It's one person. The director has her hands in everything. It's just not enough hours or time in the schedule. So it needs to.
Yeah, right. So that raises some really interesting questions around networks and structure and hierarchy, right? One of the things that we often talk about in organization and leadership studies is that not everything's leadership, right? So there are sometimes opportunities to use organizational structure to help address technical needs and duties of the job, right? So it sounds like what your work is and what your organization's at is trying to diagnose those complex adaptive challenges and then maybe some of those technical problems that need to be sorted out structurally.
Yep.
Well, that's great. Does anyone else have a similar challenge or something to add on to that? I see that there's a comment by Justin in the chat. Justin, would you be willing to elaborate more? You feel like you're the captain on a ship?
I was going to say something if Justin.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
In our small group, we went through and I hopefully tried to identify complex versus complicated, and we muddled through that. I felt we had a challenge with the adaptive space. And one of the things I felt challenged was I don't could you give us some examples of what successful adaptive spaces look like, have done, or have been, how they've been successful? I think that would have helped us understand that more and be able to utilize that one.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Dick, and I appreciate it. It's like you looked at Monica and I's slides before we started today. So, one of the things that we think about in the leadership studies literature is some of the underlying assumption of what is even leadership, right? So when we look at the leadership studies literature, there's a range of ontologies and epistemologies that inform how we think about what even leadership is and who has access to it and what practices are recognized as leadership. So one of the underlying assumptions that this complexity leadership is trying to highlight is that it's moving away from the traditional command and control structures of the top-down organization. Specifically, I think when we think about maybe military notions of leadership that are about unity of command, I think that notion of command and control infiltrates our kind of popular discourse around leadership most frequently. And that command and control model often doesn't create space for organizations to adapt or evolve or change. And so some of the research by Michael Arena and Mary Ulbein that was noted in the slide that Monica was presenting was that operational and entrepreneurial systems are often in tension in Western corporations. And what they're finding is that without intentionally creating productive tension, those systems don't evolve, right? So one of the practical ways we might think about this is oftentimes people who are really good at operational leadership might not be as good at innovation or entrepreneurial leadership, but in many contemporary organizations, the people who work themselves up the ladder often find themselves in a space or role that the things that they were really good at, they're no longer being asked to do, right? So that's one of the ways in which these tensions between operations and innovations exist. And so the research that Mary Ulbein and Michael Arena are trying to think about is how do we intentionally create those tensions productively? And so adaptive space is essentially a container in which we do that type of work. And so some of it is artificial in the sense of, a developer or trainer will come in and do intentional work with a group to try to hold the adaptive space, or it's an approach to leadership, right? And I think what Monica's portion of the presentation was trying to highlight is that oftentimes in the command and control structure, providing protection, direction, and order to your followers is often celebrated, right? You have the answer. I have the vision. Listen to me, execute. Well, that same disposition doesn't serve organizations or leadership when we're dealing with complex adaptive systems, because inherently we don't have the answer. Inherently, we need to do new learning to adjust and adapt. And we often are dealing with forms of knowledge that are dispersed across the network and not held by one person, right? And so oftentimes adaptive work is about holding space. One way to think about it is where adaptive space is about disappointing people at a rate they can absorb, right? Trying to get them to learn and engage and involve. And oftentimes what we find with middle managers and leaders that are trying to do that work, they feel tension, because oftentimes the same things that help them do adaptive work are the same things that make them feel like they're not successful, or maybe the members of the organization say, oh, well, this leader doesn't know what they're doing because they're asking me to think, or they're asking me to show up in a different way to co-create space. So that's why you see, I think, in this adaptive work, you see people often come as trainers, they come as learning and development consultants to hold that space. And so there's actually a whole host of different processes that allow people to do different types of work, like leadership coaching. It could be collaborative leadership learning groups. It could be design studios. So there's lots of different processes that leadership trainers draw on to hold that adaptive space. And so the next portion of our presentation will go in a little bit more about this, but Dick, does that help answer your question? And maybe if there's a follow-up, we can go a little bit deeper.
No, that was one of the most thorough answers I could have asked for from that question. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, maybe that's a good point for us to go a little bit deeper around the differences between leader development and leadership development. And I think this speaks to what an adaptive space might look like. And so this is coming from the Leadership as Practice literature, particularly this book that was edited by Joseph Raylan in 2016. Excuse me. But really what I want to highlight is that this is, maybe one example of what adaptive space might look like. And I want to emphasize one example among many, right? So there's lots of different ways in which the leadership studies and leadership development literature holds up adaptive space. So I just want to emphasize this is one approach among many. So Carrie, do you mind hitting that next slide? So one of the key aspects of the Leadership as Practice Development, or LAPD, approach is it's really focused on this notion of leadership development as opposed to leader development. And again, I want to premise that oftentimes when we create these binaries, people suggest that we're disregarding the leader development. Some people say that, but that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there's always going to be a space for leader development, but there's also a need and space for leadership development. Sorry, Carrie. I know I got. All right. So when we think about this with leadership development, we're focused on the in-between interactions between people. So this might be the dialogue that they're having, like their dialogic interactions. It also might be relational networks. So who's connected, who's not connected? How does information flow through the system? Are there barriers? Are there connectors? Are there boundary spanners, right? Also, we might think about the space, place, and time in which work gets accomplished, right? Are we working remotely? How do we use technology? When do we meet in person? What's the relevance of a PowerPoint and how does that shape the trajectory of a work, right? So there's this real emphasis on the process and dynamics between groups of people and systems. And then oftentimes, especially in the context of LAPD, it's contextualized within an organizational context, right? We're trying to get it closer to the real world challenge. And this is often opposed or separate from traditional approaches to leader development, right? Where we might focus on values, qualities, behavioral styles. We might emphasize skill development or competencies of an individual person. And often what we find with this type of approach to learning and development is it's okay that it takes place out of context. So this might be the traditional executive model of leadership learning development. Your company sends you off to a 3-day retreat to learn some new leadership skills. I want to recircle and say that's great and that's important work. And there's still a need to do some leadership development within organizations to help them be more nimble and able to adapt to organizational change. So Carrie, do you mind switching the next slide? So when we think about this shift from leader development to leadership development, we're acknowledging that leadership is dispersed across networks, right? And it's not necessarily located within a specific role or authority. And oftentimes I find that this is the most challenging conceptual shift that people confront, right? Because we are so accustomed to say, well, the CEO, he's the one and only leader, right? Well, maybe structurally and maybe from an ontology of leadership that accepts a top-down approach. But when we think about this through the lens of complex adaptive systems, we know that leadership work isn't just being accomplished by the people that have formal titles or formal roles. So once we make this shift and acknowledge that leadership is an activity or leadership is a practice, we're starting to acknowledge that process and practice is an essential element of how leadership work is accomplished. So a lot of the leadership as development work is about making sense of how those interactions emerge through interactions, right? Through dialogue, through relational networks, through social material engagements, right? So next slide, Carrie. So one of the ways that this gets played out is through leadership as practice development. And they often, in this context, use the language of collaborative leadership learning groups. And typically there's 4 general principles that are held up in these leadership in this collaborative leadership learning groups. So one is it's trying to get learners to reevaluate the frameworks they use to think about leadership in the context of their work. So we might call this creating new mental models. The Center for Creative Leadership might call this also kind of shifting mindsets or creating new mental models of leadership. But the way that we do that is by highlighting how leadership work shows up in spaces, right? The second principle is pointing to those sense-making elements that I mentioned in the previous slide. So if leadership is no longer anchored to a particular role or authority structure, it now becomes a practice. We need to become aware of how the different interactions, processes, and practices that we do in an everyday context produce turns of practice or leadership work. So we become focused on how leadership is interactive, it's focused on process, it's focused on interactions, and it's focused on different approaches and practices to the work, right? Principle 3 is again pointing out to that point is, remember when we think about leader development and leadership development is often contextualized within a specific context. Oftentimes that learning is trying to get the learners closer to the moment in which leadership activity is practiced, right? So it blurs the line between learning and doing and tries to make learning, the cycle between learning and doing a lot closer. Whereas opposed or differently, the leader development model, there's oftentimes a bigger gap between you learn something new and it shows up in your work, right? And that's fine. That's a different approach, right? For different needs. And then principle 4, and this is, I think, oftentimes when we actually do this leadership as practice development work, is what's most striking to the learners, is that instead of learning about leadership case studies or abstract concepts, we're learning leadership in the context of our work. And as a result of that, all of the social, political, and economic and emotional baggage maybe that gets, that makes that work messy and difficult, that is what becomes the case. So oftentimes leadership developers that are doing a collaborative leadership learning group approach find themselves helping organizations make sense of those tensions, right? Of, so-and-so got the promotion instead of so-and-so, so now they have a disagreement, right? Well, how does that impact the way the group works? Or, sales team got a boost in raises and new resources, whereas development didn't, and that shapes the way we work, right? That's what becomes the case of leadership learning and development in kind of an LAPD model. So these principles show up in different approaches, and there's not one way to do collaborative leadership learning groups, but many. So Carrie, if you hit the next slide. So when we think about this, again, these collaborative leadership learning groups are anchored to practice, and they're focused on the challenges that groups face collectively. And again, they're about holding environment, right? And this holding environment is what adaptive space is speaking to. It's trying to get people to hold tensions long enough that change can emerge. So Carrie, one more slide. All right. And so the way that this kind of shows up in collaborative leadership learning groups is, so there's kind of 3 outcomes in which the individual and group of learners develop. So one is they develop new knowledge about themselves, and they bring knowledge about their organizational work to the collaborative leadership learning group. There's opportunities to connect theoretical insights to practical challenges. So oftentimes the best collaborative leadership learning group facilitators are using leadership concepts when they're coaching their clients. So the clients can directly see how a leadership concept might show up in a particular group dynamic. And again, what that's trying to do is close the distance between when theory and learning is introduced to how it's practically expressed. And then finally, I think what's the most significant distinction between a collaborative leadership learning group approach is that knowledge is co-created, right? So instead of thinking that the trainer or the boss has the knowledge and vision, the best adaptive spaces create space for people to co-emerge new insight and knowledge, right? And that's particularly important when we think about the underlying assumptions of a complex adaptive systems challenge, that it requires learning, authority and expertise alone won't solve a challenge, and requiring engagement across the network is what's going to help people make progress. So this kind of commitment to co-created forms of knowledge is essential to the collaborative leadership learning group and to how we think about what leadership looks like in this context. So one more slide, Carrie. And now this gets finally to the examples. And so this was the slide that I've been thinking on the back of my mind since Dick raised the question here. So just some examples of how this might show up. So imagine, and these are actual examples that I know of that have happened, but because of IRBs and non-disclosure agreements, we're not allowed to give specific company names. But one example is a large multinational media firm using dialogic process consulting and leadership coaching. So the leadership coaching is an individual intervention where people diagnose their individual challenge. And then that was tied to a leadership team meeting where a lot of the strategic decisions were being made. The dialogic process consulting, the consultant was there observing how that leadership team interacted. And at the end of each meeting would come on and do some dialogic process consulting where they would ask about how the group was making sense of the challenges, how were their interactions informing the direction of the organization. And through that learning, there were shifts that slowly took place over an 18-month period, right? So that's a high touch element. Another example is a cross-sector collaboration advancing health equity. So dialogic coaching group, again, a group of individuals that represented themselves or groups and organizations showed up for an action learning project around how their network could work differently to advance health equity outcomes. And they intentionally created a space where they said, we're going to come together monthly to talk strategy about these issues, because if we don't hold this together, there's no other reason why this, cross section of individuals and organizations would ever meet. So coach came in and used leadership coaching and dialogic group coaching methods to help the group diagnose network challenges. And I noticed Monica mentioned Reno County. That is one example that we can share. Monica, did you want to maybe give a minute or so on the Reno County project as an example?
Yeah, so we were contacted to try and help put together a facilitation kind of slides. And basically it was to bring people together in the community in Reno County and Hutchinson to talk about the impacts in their community with ARPA, with COVID, and how they were going to try and address those issues using the government ARPA funds. And so then talking about what priorities were really existing in their community, how then could they address those using those funds. It was a whole task force of different people. Yes, you might have had leaders or facilitators within those groups, but the interactions and the conversations with the people is what co-emerged those solution ideas. And then they tried to go and present those to the county commission, and they agreed with some of them and then tried to move forward with how to use those funds to address those issues. But that did not come out of one particular person. That was a massive effort over months to bring in all these different groups across the community, different leaders within different groups, to make sure that everybody had a voice at the table. And that's where those answers came from, within that adaptive space.
And Monica, one of the things that I really appreciate about you sharing that Reno County example is it highlights how one of the frustrations that I think people have with complex adaptive systems is that even though there's this network of people that are engaging around an issue, oftentimes not one faction gets exactly what they want, right? Because authority and decision-making structures are still embedded within those network processes. Yep. However, but what we hope, and I think Reno County is an example of this, is that even though it didn't represent 100% of what that action learning group decided or what they advocated for, it seemed to highlight a better outcome than if it was just decided by the city manager or maybe the city commission, right?
Yeah,
And
they went
so,
with their second or third priority, not their first, but they still listened to what the priorities were.
yeah. And so I think, again, there's still a lot of effort, a lot of energy that gets put into it. So it is, we think about it as disappointing when that first order recommendation doesn't get selected. And I would always encourage us to think, well, that's better than not having that process and then just the city manager deciding their preference.
Mhm.
But maybe I'm too optimistic on that. So we have about 9 minutes until we hit our time boundary. I'd love for us to maybe consider, what would it look like for you all to maybe make this shift between leader development and leadership development in your own work? And maybe we could have folks type it into the chat. And as folks answer and think about that question, I would welcome and invite others to maybe surface some questions or observations about what was discussed today in the final few minutes we have together. Any thoughts, questions, or perspectives that we want to surface in the last 8 minutes we have?
I have a, like, not a question, I would say, but throughout this session, I felt at some point I'm being introduced to a lot of new concepts, and it was like difficult to go through it. And I would appreciate if there are a lot of examples to relate what those actually mean. Like in the breakout session, when we had a talk with Monica, she could explain what, like, in my research, what would be the adaptive space and what would be the operational system. So I could relate to the concepts that we were discussing. But this is just a suggestion I felt.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, one thing I'd always say, if you're interested in these concepts and learning more, I would recommend taking one of our Staley School Leadership Studies grad classes. We have quite a few that consider these same concepts in a lot more depth. And I also think that would be one place to start. I think generally when we think about the Graduate Student Leadership Development Program, this is an awesome opportunity to get a survey of a lot of concepts, but just what we can cover in an hour is pretty limited. So I would encourage you to take a look at some of the offerings of the Staley School and maybe take a class or two and think about these concepts more. But one thing, I don't know your academic background, but one of the things that I've often had informal conversations with are folks that run really large research labs, and how there's an operational element to some of the research that at a certain point needs to get done. We know how it gets done, data collection, yada, yada, yada. But then in order to get further grants and be competitive to create a long-term research agenda, there needs to be some type of innovative or entrepreneurial element to the lab. And so oftentimes the graduate students and the teams that are formed have strengths in different areas. So maybe someone who's really strong at collecting data isn't maybe as strong creating new ideas and thinking about the implications of the research, and vice versa, right? So adaptive space in a research lab might be finding ways for those two groups of people to interact productively, even though their intention, right, they have different priorities, different commitments. A good maybe lab research director would use some of these concepts to hold space for the data collection people and the new idea people to talk about how they might shift their research agenda to align with a long-term trajectory.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Brendan.
you're welcome.
I'll just add too, for folks who are going through the Graduate Student Leadership Development Program, you've been going through a peer coaching process that has a really kind of structured holding environment for working through challenges. So thinking about how could you use a process like peer coaching or group coaching as a container to work through a shared challenge that your team is going through. That could be one really practical way of helping the group come together and have that space to diagnose the challenge, get curious, and then imagine different possibilities.
Exactly. And that's even, I appreciate that example, Dr. Priest, because that's like a small touch point, right? Just even showing up differently in our spaces by being more curious and asking questions could also be a way that these ideas translate practically. All right, we have about 4 minutes left. Are there any final thoughts, questions, observations before we call it an afternoon? All right, well, if not, I noticed that Dr. Priest mentioned that there's some additional resources on the Canvas page. I'm really thankful that you are here with us today, and thank you, Monica, for collaborating with me on this presentation. It was a joy to